of the here and now. But also people begin to theorize, I think, about their relationship with the state. And actually there are many scholars working on Cocos who are looking at the community's relationship with states. And I know that Monica Winanita and Nick Harriman have been working on the Cocos Malay relationship with the state, and historians like John Hunt and more recently Michael Laffan have been working on the historical dimensions of the Cocos relationship with the state. And so this becomes a really interesting area where I think individuals and the Cocos community's own views have to be placed at the forefront of any discussion about colonialism, because Cocos is a very, on the one hand, it's a very unique cultural context, although on the other hand, there are some comparable situations elsewhere in the world. But in the Australian colonial story, if I can say that, it is a very special and unique place. There are relationships with Christmas Island, but again, that is completely different as well. And so in answering your question, Joanna, and I'll turn over to Jenny for her to reflect on this as well. I mean, I feel that it's very hard to take one definition of colonialism and work with that, because I think there are multiple definitions of colonialism going on here. And on a micro level, on a macro level. And there's no doubt that it was many forms of colonialism. But when you begin to talk to the community as well, you begin to see levels of complexity that come into the story of transnational flows and agency and so on. So it's a very layered and constantly evolving view of the relationship between the community and states. And what I think is particularly exciting, and this is where the work of Jenny has been very groundbreaking, is looking at the Malay, Cocos Malay communities' new connections with the Malay world and the Islamic Ummah, more broadly speaking, because I think that is refiguring and reconstituting the Cocos Malay place in the world over very recent times. And I'll turn over to Jenny now to say more about everything.
Thanks for that, David. I guess I could speak about sort of similar sort of points from my own sort of way of thinking about this stuff relating to Cocos. I feel like Cocos Islands have had these, as you say, really complex relationships with different types of outsides, different types of others for 200 plus years, and some of that is what we would traditionally and easily think of as a colonial relationship with the Scottish family and with various sort of European and then Australian states. And I feel like at the moment, I think the community has a really interesting and complex and ambivalent relationship with a lot of that stuff, especially relating to, as we were looking at culture and music, because some of it, and this is really similar to what you'll also find on a lot of other small islands, has been quite acculturated and taken on as ours. Like the viola, for example, which is that, if you think about it from our perspective, sounds like quite a complex question, but the viola is a Cocos Malay thing, unproblematically. Even if some of the tunes that they play sound, quite European to us, and some of the tunes sounds a lot more Malay archipelago. So that's a whole really interesting and complex area. But then the layer that is more, well, is kind of more important to them recently, I guess, is Islam. And the way that the Cocos Islanders interface with different streams of Islam that come, like, sometimes literally physically to visit them. The different teachers from different groups will come to Ireland and visit the community, and different parts of the community have, you know, slightly different beliefs and systems there. And in terms of agency, I would say that is really where the islanders that I've met have been employing their agency. Voting with their feet is to focus since the vote of self-determination and becoming Australian citizens, to expand their knowledge of their faith, go on the Hajj, visit different communities in the archipelago as well, and yeah, really sort of focus on their faith.
Wonderful, thank you. With the explanation on that transnational religious flows that you've just highlighted there, Jenny, you were saying with the Hajj, the pilgrimage to the Hajj, that's quite recent as well, isn't it? And also you could hear the nasheed that's coming from Malaysia. So
Exactly.
So that's one way of expressing transnational religious flows through the Indian Ocean and past there. So I was wondering if there are any other questions to David and Jenny about the movie itself, or the topic on transnational religious flows and how that is expressed through Malay music, Malay Muslim music and dance, and it's a melange with Scottish and viola that they see as their own. That's what you were saying there, Jenny and David. Do we have any more questions? Yes, we have from Anna. I think the microphone is being moved.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, David, and thank you, Jenny. Yeah, we're so delighted you can be here today, so we really, really appreciate that, especially with time zone differences and things. It's, yeah, absolutely fascinating film. And I guess my question, because I've not been to the Cocos Islands, around, so a lot of the presentations today, and I've done some research on Buddhism across the far north of Queensland and also in the Torres Strait Islands. So a lot of our presentations have focused on sort of materiality, and whether the three of you could just maybe also speak about the built environment, like in terms of spaces. So and so we did see some things happening in mosques, but also in halls. And what about things like funerary rites or cemeteries, things like that, other kind of places where music would be performed as part of ritual? Thank you.
Jenny, do you want to start, or should?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Yes, so the Cocos Islands are really small. What is it, 14 square kilometers, something like that? And the settlement, the Malay settlement, is sort of one smallish village with about sort of 4 streets or so. So the amount of sort of actual physical space we're talking about, for context, that is quite small. By the time that we first visited, they had built their lovely new mosque, which had been part funded. Most of the buildings on island are sort of looked after by the Australian state. Is that right? But the mosque had external funding. Prior to that, they had we think probably 3 separate mosques within the campus, which is really interesting. Historically, that sort of points towards maybe having had different, sort of groups within the Islamic practice, and different sort of family groupings within there. If you also saw So you saw some footage recorded outside the mosque where they were doing the seated dance. So that's something that can happen there. And the really interesting thing about the Cocos Islands is that on Home Island, within that community, that's one of the, or maybe the only place in Australia where you hear the call to prayer out loud, because this is basically a settlement where almost everybody practices Islam, and so that is completely fine and normal. And a lot of stuff happens outside, so it comes out into the environment. It's quite public, it's hot. We've got doors and windows outside. We've got open verandas. So to have the music outside the mosque there is quite a regular thing, I think. And also, if you were having sort of more family celebrations, a lot of people have got big verandas out the back of their house where they'll sit down. You saw at one point people sitting round in a square that was outside somebody's house. Also, there was some prayer, I think, being chanted there at one point. And then the big building that you saw, which was the more secular music, with the fiddle and everything, is the what do they call it? The community centre, which is also the cyclone shelter.
The Malay word is much more pretty, right? The community centre, but in English we call it the cyclone shelter.
Yes. Which is the biggest, I would say, probably building there, and that's really a multi-purpose hall, and you can have a big community meal in there if it's raining, or any kind of performances would often happen in there as well, for the bright lights, I think, probably, apart from anything else. What else can you think of, David?
Well, there was the mention of funerals, and that made me think of, by contrast, weddings, because in the Islamic context, funerals take place very quickly, within 24 hours, and we were not there, and we would not have been able to see anything like that. There is a beautiful cemetery. It's one of the most beautiful parts of the island, actually, and there's a lot of history in that cemetery, and there have been studies of the tomb markers, that some of which date back to the final third of the 19th century. But weddings are a really big thing in Cocos Malay culture, and again, you really have to, well, be lucky enough to coincide with one, or to know that one's coming and to plan a trip. But people converge on Home Island from many places. Monica, I think you've been at a wedding, right, on Home Island?
Not at a wedding.
Not at a wedding.
Unfortunately, no, almost at several weddings, but the preparation for the wedding takes about a month, and the wedding itself takes 7 days of music and dance and prayers at both the groom's and the bride's house. And yes, so I've been the months leading up to it and seen videos of it taken by Cocos Islanders. But yes, absolutely. As Jenny and yourself said, ritual in terms of life, cutting off the hair of a child who was just born, and then you have the I have been to the one circumcision, so there is kind of life ritual which has prayers as well as music, so those things go together kind of hand in hand. And because it's a small island, if you have a party on one side, everyone just goes. So it's it's a whole island party, like tropical in the heat. So you see that a lot of the footages are outside itself. Unfortunately, we do have to go at 4:55. I've just been notified. So last 2 minutes, if you have any other comments, Jenny, David, to add to that, or you happy with so
I just
far?
wanted to say very, very quickly, thank you for that answer. And that also, when we were looking at the far north, looking at Buddhism, and the cemetery sites were really amazing, like really beautiful and really incredible places. And there's some great photographs actually by Ernestine Hill, who I don't think went to the Cocos Islands, but she travelled all the way across the north. She was a journalist in the 1920s and 30s, and she took incredible photos of ceremonies at some of the cemetery sites as well, which kind of tuned us into that. So she's another person really worth looking at in terms of these interconnected stories, yeah, and flows. So thank you again. Thank you from me. Back to Monica.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
I was going to put in the chat a blog that we did, but I can't find it. That has more of the pictures, material pictures as well of those religious flows. So maybe I'll follow that up later. But thank you so much, Jenny and David, for joining us from Spain and also from the UK early in the morning. So start of the day. But have a good rest of the day. And
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having us.